Thank you. It's more like a response to Brian and Gerald before that I'm unfortunately not as optimistic about our beautiful city. I'm a little bit more cynical, and I'm not the ambassador necessarily, because I come with a lot more skepticism and cynicism to this. So what I'm particularly interested is in the imagination and the politics of space. And one of the key things that really nags me is that pre-1994, all of us understood the power and the influence of space, that it was used as an instrument to organize our society. But post-1994, we seem to have forgotten the power and the influence that space can have in organizing a new society. It seems now that we're completely open and vulnerable to the free market. So I'll just jump in, and I'm gonna this is a little bit of a succinct talk, so I'm gonna, excuse me if I read a little bit of this. Okay, so I'm an architect, and my obsession is space, the reading of it, its meanings, and its consequences. I would say I'm a keen observer of how human beings of all orders and abilities arrange their physical and perceptual spaces. I'm constantly on the lookout for the hidden language of space in our everyday lives. Through the very articulation of our spaces, we communicate our values and our relationship to the world that we inhabit. This is a story about my recent readings in Johannesburg and its consequences for creative practitioners. It is also about how to creatively respond more thoughtfully through the critical observation of the spaces we inhabit. The Johannesburg that I find myself in today is a peculiar one. It is all things spectacular and dreadful in equal measure at any given time. It is schizophrenic, fractured, unfair, aggressive, chaotic, stimulating, and nourishing. My reading of its space suggests that we are in a precarious yet fertile times. There is this extraordinary, catastrophic coming together of multiple worlds in Johannesburg. With gross inequality and a rampant free market, this city gives rise to unique spatial consequences in an explicit but honest manner. Gerald, I am from Cape Town. This makes me, like many of its ancestors to Johannesburg, a migrant, more specifically a prospector. I too come to seek my piece of gold. A similar relationship between city and its subject is established to that of the late 1800s. During my time in Johannesburg and through its tumultuous and adolescent transformations, I have mined insightful intellectual capital in a largely one-sided transaction. This capital, or gold, that I seek are the emergent spaces and the aggressive contestations which bring sophisticated and authentic spatial arrangement to our public and private lives. An intellectual debt is subsequently built up, one which I have become obliged to repay, establishing a healthy reciprocity between city and prospector. We have a distorted landscape of imagination in Johannesburg. Our authorities are overflowing with crisis in coping with the burgeoning city and are the unlikely agents for imaginative alternative possibilities. The creative agents of the elite with abundant resources are running dry with innovation. However, the marginalized who rely on their survivalist strategies are ripe with imagination and innovation. A cruel gift from the gods of cities, if you ask me. Mine, then, is the task to make creative choices and interventions between these polarized worlds of capital and imagination, of resourced and resourceful. In so doing, I attempt to reconcile my awkward personal relationship with these gross and unjust contradictions of the city. Imagination becomes the vehicle for responding to the potentials which surface in the city. I explore imagination in three distinct ways, as illustrated through the following three projects. The Shebeen, or informal drinking tavern, as it is known in South Africa, as commonly found in South Africa's informal settlement, an example of this imagination manifest. Here, users are forced to adapt their own imagination, forced to adapt their own environments with a great deal of sophistication to suit their specific needs, as well as that of the larger community. In these sites, where multiple and complex forces influence space, innovative emergent situations arise. These relate to mitigating conflict within the confined drinking space, allowing the owner to trade in liquor while in ill health or with limited resources, harassment from the authorities, the police, and negotiation between the owner's private and entrepreneurial lives. The spatial arrangement and its architecture supports the resilience of the user by being adaptable. This is evidenced through the interdependent small enterprises such as recycling, fast food, and buying, which support further livelihoods. The use of the Shebeen as a public space during off-peak hours with people gathering in and passing by the space. The adaptability of the structure through the adding and subtracting of rooms for extra income or greater efficiency. The strategic arrangement of public and private spaces with windows, doors, and hatches, allowing for strategic surveillance and control. It is through this intimate observation of the seemingly ordinary and prolific situations arising in the city that enable me to respond in a more thoughtful and creative manner. It is not only through the vulnerable inhabitants of our cities that we should lean on for imagination. As creative agents, we too have an obligation to imagine and speculate. This needs to be done in a manner that is deeply rooted in the particular circumstances of this place. Through this experimental project cited in a street in Johannesburg, I sought to arrange the static and mundane relationships between public and private spaces, which are highly protected and conservative, as we know in South Africa today. Here I sought to provoke another way of conceptualizing our spaces by using practical and familiar devices. Using the familiar is a way to demonstrate that these imaginaries are possible and within our physical and technical reach. The balcony, which is an extension of the private interior space, a threshold between our public and private worlds, it typically belongs to the occupants of the private space. In the spirit of disturbing and inspired by the American cruise liners that dock at small port towns in the Caribbean, which instantly disrupt the local rhythm, I suggest that the private balcony does not belong to the private owner. Instead, it belongs to the street. This means that it can be used by anyone for any purpose. The situation, albeit fantastical, attempts to immediately adjust and disturb the normative relationship between private interior and public exterior. To enable this public appropriation of the balcony, a system of mobile scaffolding and staircases, similar to what one sees outside Manhattan apartments, is attached to the street facade of the building. These comprise of stairs, landings, pulleys, wheels, which allow it to attach itself anywhere along the street facade. The intention is to stimulate our imagination about more sophisticated spatial arrangements in an otherwise muted environment. This becomes an exercise in co-production of imagination between user and architect. The architect plays the provocateur, stimulating the infinite imagination of the users, which would also exceed any expectation the architect may have. Through observation and imagination, one is able to apply these lessons to actual interventions and not keep them hypothetical. The task of a street upgrade became tricky when we were instructed by our clients to make our proposed long benches shorter and avoid the vagrants sleeping on them, and also to ignore the existing traders that operated in the area. Wedged between a client and a now vulnerable users of the space, we contrived a manipulative scheme. We designed shorter benches, and these were approved. However, we then went on site and were able to extend these benches by simply placing them next to each other. In considering the vulnerable traders, we documented their positions and their basic infrastructure for setting up shop. This typically involved shade cloth held up by a few poles. We then motivated on a technical basis for why the holes needed to be put into the benches, and these holes conveniently matched the sizes of the traders' poles. This allowed the traders to easily appropriate the installed benches by placing their poles in the bench holes. This design is informed by a keen observation of the physical conditions, social vulnerability, and institutional structures in place. The design subversively sought to find ways for the users to occupy and imagine their own uses for the space in spite of a repressive logic. So, and in working in practice, it's important not just to speculate and to dream, but it's important to act on these things. And you build up an obligation with the sights and perceptions that you have. And in practice, what I attempted to do at this point with this invite for this talk is to put together a manifesto which is a public declaration to myself, to hold myself accountable to this public audience. And they are quite simple. They're 4 points. Basically, we need to observe critically that we've got an amazing mine, which is Johannesburg. We need to provoke, and we need to open up the imaginaries of our people, and they are also existing in front of us. We also need not just to observe, but we also need to act, especially if you're a creative practitioner like myself. And the other is to be a creative broker. We've got this duality of immense capital and immense imagination, and it's about playing the double agent between that space. So that's the manifesto that I declare to you publicly.